The women on the construction site called him fine boy. Not to his face. To his face they called him nothing, because the women who passed the construction site on Afolabi Street in Suralire every morning did not generally speak to the men mixing cement and carrying blocks in the heat. But among themselves, at the pepper stall, and at the borehole, and in the compound where 3 of them lived on the same floor, they called him fine boy. He was worth discussing. Even in a dusty construction site vest and worn trousers caked at the knees with cement, even with a wheelbarrow in his hands and sweat on his face, the man they called fine boy was the kind of man who made people look twice. Tall, broad-shouldered, strong jaw, eyes that were calm and slightly amused at everything, as if the world were a long joke he had heard before and still found worth listening to. Hands that moved with a precision that seemed wrong for someone whose job was to carry things from one place to another. One woman said he looked like he belonged somewhere else. She was more right than she knew. His name, the name the construction site knew him by, was Emeka. Just Emeka. The site foreman, a loud and practical man named Babatund, had taken him on 3 weeks earlier without asking many questions because the man was strong, showed up earlier than everyone else, and did not complain about anything. These 3 qualities were rarer than they should have been, and Babatund was not the kind of foreman who interrogated gifts. The real name of the man they called Emeka was Emeka Okuye, which was true as far as it went. What the construction site did not know was the rest of it. Emeka Okuye, 32 years old, CEO of Okoye Group, a real estate development company that had built, among other things, for residential estates in Lagos, 2 in Abuja, and 1 luxury complex currently under construction in Port Harcourt whose projected value would make the Afolabi Street site look like a child's sandcastle. He had a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building in Lekki with a view of the lagoon. He had a driver named Cosmos who arrived each morning at 7 and waited without complaint. He had 3 suits that cost more than most people in Suralire earned in 6 months. He had appeared in 2 property magazines this year, and in 1 lifestyle feature that had used the word visionary with a confidence that had made him slightly uncomfortable. He had been on the Afolabi Street site for 3 weeks. He had mixed cement. He had carried blocks. He had eaten suya from the roadside stall at lunch with the other workers and listened to their conversations about football and landlords and the rising cost of Gary and what the government was and was not doing about it. He had been happier in those 3 weeks than he had been in 3 years. He was still examining that. The story of why Emeka Okoye was pushing a wheelbarrow in Suralire instead of sitting in his 14th floor office began, as many of his stories did, with his mother, Mama Okoye, whose full name was Mrs. Patricia Okoye, but who answered to Mama Okoye from everyone including people who had known her since before Emeka was born, was a woman of decisive opinions and tremendous energy who had decided, upon her son's 32nd birthday, that the primary deficiency in his otherwise well-constructed life was the absence of a wife. She had not arrived at this conclusion suddenly. She had been building toward it for several years with the patience and structural integrity of someone who had watched her son build things for a living and understood that good foundations require time. Her approach was organized. She invited women to dinner. Carefully selected women. Educated, well-presented. From families whose backgrounds she had assessed with the thoroughness of a due diligence report. She arranged these dinners at the family house in Victoria Island with the attention of someone staging an important event, because she understood that was what it was. Emeka attended the first dinner. He sat across from a woman named Chidinma who had a law degree and beautiful eyes and who spent the evening telling him, with the specificity of someone who had done considerable research, exactly what she admired about the Okoye Group's portfolio. She mentioned the Aja estate by name. She mentioned the Abuja project. She spoke about his company's trajectory with the enthusiasm of an investor rather than a woman at dinner. She was not unpleasant. She had simply decided who he was before the soup arrived. He attended the second dinner. The woman's name was Adiz. She was a banker, and she was genuinely interesting. Quick mind, good sense of humor, stories about her work that made him lean forward. Then, in the middle of a conversation about literature that he had been enjoying, she smoothly pivoted to a question about his company's plans for the Lekki corridor that had the unmistakable structure of something she had prepared before she arrived. He felt the conversation change temperature, and never quite warmed up again. He attended the third dinner, then immediately wished he had not. The woman that evening was perfectly pleasant, well-dressed, and had clearly decided before arriving that she approved of him. She agreed with everything he said. When he said something mildly provocative to test it, she agreed with that too. By dessert he felt like a man dining alone in the company of his own reflection. He told his mother afterwards that he was grateful for her efforts and asked her to stop. His mother gave him the look she had given him when he was 7 and had said something she found both intelligent and completely beside the point. She said, "What are you looking for, Emeka?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "Someone who does not know what I have before they know who I am." His mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That is going to be very difficult given that your picture has appeared in 2 magazines this year, and you drove yourself here in a car that costs more than most houses." He said, "I know." She said, "So what do you intend to do about it?" He did not have an answer that evening, but the question followed him. He thought about it through 2 more dinners he managed to avoid, and one he could not. He thought about it in his 14th floor office looking at the lagoon. He thought about it signing off on architectural drawings for the Port Harcourt complex, looking at the plans for buildings that would be described in magazines as visionary, built by men whose names nobody would ever put in a magazine. He thought about the men on his construction sites. He thought about their invisibility. He thought about how much they saw and how little they were seen. He thought about the version of himself that existed without the company, without the portfolio, without the photograph in the magazine. He was not entirely sure that version had been tested. He wanted to test it. He called his most trusted site manager, a quietly competent man named Mr. Peters, and explained what he needed. Mr. Peters listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When Emeka finished, Mr. Peters said, "You want to work as a laborer on another developer's site?" Emeka said, "Yes." Mr. Peters said, "I can arrange the referral through a third party so your name does not come up." He paused. "Should I ask why?" Emeka said, "You should not." Mr. Peters said, "Understood." 3 weeks later, Emeka Okoye arrived on Afolabi Street in Surulere wearing a faded vest and worn trousers and carrying a bag that looked like it contained everything he owned. Babatund looked at him, asked if he could carry weight, received a yes, and put him to work immediately. He was shown to the section where the other workers slept in a rented room near the site. He told them he had a place to stay and would not need the room. Nobody questioned this. Privacy was not an unusual preference. He went home each evening to his apartment in Lekki, not the family house, not the 14th floor, and showered and ate, and sat on his balcony and thought about what he had observed during the day. He was not performing poverty. He was not performing hardship. He was simply removing, for a time, the things that preceded him in every room he walked into, to see what remained. What remained, he was discovering, was still quite a lot. Now, before we meet the woman who would change everything about this arrangement, here is who she was. Her name was Ngozi Ease. 28 years old. She had grown up in Enugu and come to Lagos at 23 for her NYSC posting, fallen in love with the city's chaos the way some people fall in love with difficult things, and decided to stay. She taught secondary school biology at Surulere High School, a 20-minute Danfo ride from the compound on Afolabi Street, where she shared a self-contained apartment with her younger sister Adiz, who was studying accounting at a polytechnic nearby. She had a first-class degree in biology from the University of Nigeria and had been offered a postgraduate scholarship twice. Once she had deferred, once she had declined entirely because she could not leave her sister in Lagos alone and the scholarship did not cover dependents. She had made this decision without drama and rarely mentioned it. She woke at 5:45 every morning. She packed her lunch the evening before so the morning would not be rushed. She left the compound at 6:45 with her bag over one shoulder and her food container in her hand, and walked to the bus stop with the efficiency of a woman who had calculated exactly how much time she had and intended to use it fully. She read on the bus. Always. A novel or a science journal or sometimes both, switching between them with the comfort of someone for whom reading was not a hobby, but simply what you did when you were not doing something else. She loved her students in the specific way of a teacher who had decided that the job was worth doing completely or not at all. She stayed after school twice a week for extra classes that nobody had asked her to run, and for which she was not paid. She kept a notebook, separate from her teaching journal, in which she recorded the moment each student first understood something they had been struggling with. Not grades. Not test scores. The moment of understanding itself. She was not impressed by money. This was not a performance or a position she had arrived at through philosophy. She simply found that wealth, by itself, told her very little about a person that was worth knowing. She had met rich people who were tedious and poor people who were fascinating, and vice versa in all combinations, and had concluded that the balance sheet was an unreliable guide to the interior. This was the woman who stepped out of the compound gate on the third morning and nearly walked into a man carrying an iron rod. The morning he held the hard hat over her head in the rain was the 9th day after she first noticed him. She had been noticing him the way she noticed things that she had not yet categorized, with attention, without conclusion. When the hard hat appeared above her in the rain, she looked at him, and he said, "It is the best I have," and she almost smiled because it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her all week. She had learned his name was Emeka. She had told him hers was Ngozi. They had talked for 7 minutes under a yellow hard hat in the Lagos rain, and established the basic facts of two strangers becoming slightly less so. That night she decided to bring tea the following morning because she was pragmatic, and when she found herself thinking about something, the simplest response was to address it rather than let it occupy space it had not earned. She brought 2 cups and a flask. She was right too. He was already at the site when she arrived and came to the gate when she called, and looked at the flask with an expression that was surprised and then not surprised, which she found interesting. She filed it away. She was a biologist. She filed things. They drank tea at the gate and talked, and she asked how long he had been doing this work, and he said, "Not as long as it looks," and she said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "It means I came to this site recently." And she accepted this because it was not the kind of morning for pursuing things that were not ready to be pursued. She went to her bus. He went back to his site. But something had shifted, the kind of small shift that matters more than large ones because it happens without announcement. The morning tea became a pattern. Not every day. She had a life, and so did he, and she was not a woman who rearranged her life around a new thing before she understood it. But 3 mornings a week, then 4, then 5. They talked to the site gate for 10 or 15 minutes in the part of the morning when Lagos was still deciding what kind of day it was going to be. He was unlike anyone she talked to on a regular basis. He thought carefully. When she said something, he did not immediately respond. He sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with a calculation before you commit to an answer. She found this unusual, and then found she preferred it to its alternative. He asked questions about her work that were not polite questions. They were the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what it was like to do what she did. When she told him about a student, Teo, 15, brilliant with theory but freezing in practical sessions, he listened with complete attention and then said, "What if the practical sessions were framed as thought experiments rather than tests? Give her the outcome first, and ask her to work backward to the process. It removes the performance pressure." She stopped. She wrote it in her notebook. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if this story is speaking to something in you, please subscribe to Visa's Tales. You will not want to miss what happens next. He said, "Sorry. I think out loud sometimes." She said, "Construction workers do not usually suggest pedagogical approaches." He said, "Maybe more of them should." She looked at him steadily. He looked back with that expression that was calm and slightly amused, and gave away less than it seemed to. She said, "Who are you actually?" He said, "Emeka." "I told you." She said, "That is your name. That is not who you are." A long moment between them. He said, "I will tell you. When the time is right." She said, "What makes it not right now?" He said, "Because I want to know if you will still be here when it is." She looked at him. Then she picked up her flask and went to her bus stop. But she came back the next morning. And the one after that. She was aware that she was making a decision each time she came back. She was not someone who drifted into things. She came back because the 10 minutes at the site gate had become the part of her day she thought about most, and she had long ago decided that the things worth her attention deserved to be paid it. She did not know who he was. She was beginning to know what he was. And what he was, beneath the worn vest and the cement dust, was someone who paid full attention to things. Not to important things. To things. To the specific student who froze in practical sessions. To the question she had not finished asking before he had understood where it was going. To the morning. She found, over the weeks that followed, that she was paying full attention back. One morning she brought Akira wrapped in paper from the woman at the compound gate, and they ate it at the site fence, and she told him about growing up in Enugu. He listened with the quality of listening that felt less like politeness and more like genuine accumulation. Like someone adding to a picture they intended to keep. He told her he was from Lagos, but had spent time in the East as a child. His father had been a civil engineer. He said this with a specific pause after it that she registered but did not press. Another morning she asked him what he would do if he could do anything. He said, "Something that lasts after I'm gone." She said, "That is not specific enough." He said, "I know. I am still working out what specific looks like." She looked at him. She said, "I think you've already started." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was more than the calm amusement she was used to. He said, "Why do you think that?" She said, "Because a person who is still at the beginning of working it out would not have the patience you have. And patience is not something you practice. It is something you develop after you have built something, and watched it take longer than you expected." He was quiet for a long time after that. She went to her bus. He remained at the gate looking at Afolabi Street, and thinking that she had just described his career to him more accurately than any magazine profile had ever managed to. He had been on the site 6 weeks when Mr. Fashola, the site's actual developer, came for a progress inspection. Emeka had known this was coming. He had made it his business to know the site's schedule precisely, and had positioned himself on the far side of the foundations with his hard hat at an angle that would make identification difficult. Mr. Fashola arrived with 2 associates, inspected the work with Baba Tund, stayed 40 minutes, and left without looking in Emeka's direction once. Baba Tund came to find him afterward to tell him to move some materials to the 2nd floor. Emeka said, "Yes, sir." Baba Tund looked at him for an extra second. Then he went back to what he was doing. But Emeka knew the arrangement had a natural end. Lagos was a city where everyone knew everyone through 3 people at most, and he had already pressed his luck once. He had also been thinking, for 2 weeks, about when and how to tell her. He told her on a Thursday morning. He had brought a thermos this time. Not her flask but his own, a good one. And a packet of biscuits. She had raised her eyebrows at the biscuits. He said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "I know." He stopped. She picked up a biscuit and said, "You are not a construction worker." "I have known for about 2 weeks." He was quiet. She said, "When Mr. Fashola came to inspect the site, he left the architectural drawings on Baba Tund's table. I was at the gate. I could see them from where I stood. You walked past that table, and you stopped for 3 seconds and looked at the drawings the way someone reads a language they know well. Not curiously. Familiarly." She ate the biscuit. "Also your hands. Construction workers develop calluses at the base of the fingers from gripping tools. Your calluses are on the fingertips and the lateral edges of the palms. That is a draftsman's hand. Or an architect's. Someone who works with precision instruments and drawing tools over many years." She looked at him. "And nobody who carries blocks mentions load-bearing coefficients in casual conversation." He looked at her for a very long time. She said, "What I do not know is why." He told her everything. The dinners his mother arranged. The women who knew his portfolio before his face. The magazine photographs. The question he had been asking himself. The answer he had come to Suralire to look for. He told it plainly, without performing apology, because the woman sitting across from him would see through performed apology the way she had seen through everything else. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "So you came here to find someone who did not know who you were?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And did you find one?" He said, "I found someone who identified my callus pattern and told me a pedagogical approach for a student she had never met. So yes, I believe so." She looked at the thermos. Then back at him. He said, I owe you an apology. Not for coming here. I would make that decision again. But for the weeks I sat across from you knowing what I was not saying. You were honest with me from the first morning. I was not honest back. That was not fair to you, and I am sorry for it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need you to understand something. If this becomes something, it becomes something because of who you are at a site gate in the morning with a thermos. Not because of any estate in Aja. Not because of Port Harcourt. Not because of any magazine. She looked at him steadily. I am a secondary school biology teacher. I earn 62,000 naira a month. I share an apartment with my sister. I have no interest in being managed, and a significant interest in being told the truth from now on. He said, I understand all of that. She said, good. She stood and picked up her bag. She had a class at 8. Then she said, bring better biscuits next time. She walked to the bus stop. He sat at the gate with the thermos and looked at Afolabi Street waking up around him. The bread seller pushing her cart, the school children in uniforms, a woman hanging washing from a second-floor window, and felt something resolve itself in him the way a long calculation finally arrives at its correct answer. The news broke the way Lagos news always breaks. Fast, sideways, and with tremendous enthusiasm. It began with a photograph taken from a second-floor window by a compound woman named Auntie Bose who had been monitoring the morning tea situation for 3 weeks with the dedication of someone working a beat. She had captured, without either of them knowing, the image of a tall man in a construction vest sitting at a site gate talking to a woman with a flask. She posted it to the neighborhood WhatsApp group, Afolabi Street and environs, with the caption, Fine boy and teacher having their morning meeting again. The photograph reached 4 more WhatsApp groups before noon. In one of those groups, someone recognized the face beneath the cement dust. Then the archive photographs arrived. Property conference websites. Magazine spreads. The lifestyle feature. Emeka Okoye, CEO of Okoye Group, in a dark suit in a glass office. Emeka Okoye reviewing blueprints at an Abuja project in a clean hard hat. Emeka Okoye at a charity gala in Victoria Island, looking like exactly the kind of man that belongs somewhere other than Afolabi Street. The Afolabi Street and environs WhatsApp group went into a state that could only be described as collective structural failure. Auntie Bose, who had taken the photograph, received 67 replies in 20 minutes, and spent the rest of the morning reading them with the satisfaction of someone whose investment had paid off considerably beyond expectations. Baba Tund, who had employed him for 6 weeks and called him Emeka, and once lent him a spanner, sat in his foreman's chair with the news and was quiet for a very long time. Then he said to the worker sitting nearest him, That man carried blocks for me. He said it with an expression that suggested he was not sure how to feel about this, which was reasonable because he was not sure how to feel about this. In Victoria Island, a woman named Shadinma had sat across from Emeka at the first dinner and spent the evening discussing his company's portfolio with the enthusiasm of someone who had done considerable research, saw the story on a friend's WhatsApp status and put down her phone and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She had been so certain she knew who he was. She had known his Aju estate and his Abuja project and his company trajectory. She had not known, and could not have known, that the man across the table from her had already decided that everyone who knew those things before they knew him was not the person he was looking for. She picked up her phone again. She did not share the story. The women who had called him fine boy among themselves now called him fine boy to his face and added so, which embarrassed him more than they anticipated it would. Ngozi's sister Adiz called her at lunch. There was a pause when she answered. Then Adiz said, Sister. The man from the site. Ngozi said, Eat your food. Adiz said, Sister. What's up? Ngozi said, I will talk to you at home. Adiz said, Sister. He built the estate in Aja. Ngozi said, I know. She had said those words to him 2 days before he told her. She had looked it up the same evening she first heard the name Okoye Group from the drawing she had seen on Babatun's table. She had sat with the information for 2 weeks, watching to see if it would change what she thought about the man at the site gate. It had not. She said again, I know. Then she went back to her students. In Lekki, Mama Okoye received a phone call from her friend who had contacts near Afolabi Street. She listened to the complete story without speaking. When it finished, she said, so he went to find someone who did not already know him. And he found her at a construction site gate over tea. Her friend said, she brings the flask herself, apparently. Every morning. Mama Okoye was quiet for a moment. Then she said, God has a very particular sense of humor. She paused. And very good taste. She called Emeka. He answered on the second ring. She said, Emeka. He said, Mama. She said, tell me about the biology teacher. He told her. He took longer than he usually took to tell his mother things. She noted this carefully and said nothing about it. When he finished, she said, she noticed your calluses. He said, yes. She said, and she told you the biscuits were poor quality. He said, she told me to bring better ones next time. Mama Okoye was quiet again. Then she said, bring her to dinner. Sunday. Not the kind I have been organizing. Just dinner. My jollof rice. He said, I will ask her. She said, ask properly. Ngozi came on Sunday. She wore a simple blouse and a good wrapper, and brought a container of moi moi she had made the night before, because she was not the kind of person who arrived at someone's home empty-handed, regardless of whose home it was. She greeted Mama Okoye properly, admired the house without performing admiration, and sat at the dinner table and ate the jollof rice with the focused attention of someone who took food seriously. When Mama Okoye asked what she thought of it, Ngozi said, the tomato ratio is exactly right. The bay leaf is slightly too present. The room was quiet. Mama Okoye looked at her for a full 3 seconds. Then she said, my husband said the same thing for 30 years. I argued with him every time. Ngozi said, he was right. Mama Okoye laughed. It was the laugh of a woman who had not been surprised in a long time and found the sensation unexpectedly pleasant. She looked at her son across the table. He was watching Ngozi with the expression of a man who had been looking for the answer to a question for a very long time and no longer needed to look. After dinner, when Ngozi had gone and Emeka was helping clear the table, Mama Okoye said quietly, she is not trying to impress you. He said, I know. His mother said, in 32 years I have brought many women to this table. She handed him a plate to dry. That is the first time I have heard the truth about the bay leaf. He dried the plate. He said, I know. She said, do not waste this, Emeka. He said, I will not. She handed him another plate. Outside, Lagos continued to be Lagos, enormous and indifferent, and alive in its particular way. And in the kitchen in Victoria Island, a woman who had spent 3 years arranging dinners felt, for the first time, that the right one had found its own way to the table. The following morning she called her friend and said, quietly and with finality, that she would not be needing any more referrals. This story is not about a prince finding a princess. It is about a man who understood that the most valuable thing he possessed was not in any magazine or on any property register, and who had the intelligence to go looking for it somewhere those things could not follow. He had everything. He had buildings and a company and a name that opened rooms. What he did not have was someone who would look at him. Only at him, not at the name, not the rooms, not the buildings, and say, your calluses are in the wrong place, and your biscuits need improvement, and the bay leaf is too present. She had declined 2 scholarships to stay with her sister. She had run unpaid extra classes twice a week for students nobody had asked her to help. She had brought tea to a construction gate every morning not because she expected anything from it, but because the 10 minutes were worth paying attention to. She was the kind of person who did the right thing when there was no audience for it, and who did not mention it afterwards. He found her at a construction site gate in Surulere on ordinary mornings over tea that cooled too fast in the Lagos heat. She found him exactly the same way. A man who listened before he spoke, who sat with questions before he answered them, who held a yellow hard hat over her head in the rain because it was the best he had. She did not care about the estate in Aja. She did not care about the magazine profile, or the 14th floor, or the Port Harcourt complex. She cared about the 10 minutes at the gate in the morning, and whether the person she was talking to was actually there, and whether what they said to each other was true. It was From the beginning, even when not everything was said, what was said was true. The world is full of people who will know what you have before they know who you are. That is not their failure. That is just how the world is arranged. But somewhere, in ordinary places on ordinary mornings, over tea at a gate, there are people who will see you without all the things that usually arrive ahead of you. Those are the people worth the patience. And they will always notice that the calluses are in the wrong place. If this story moved something in you, tell us in the comments. Have you ever been truly seen by someone who had every reason not to look? Tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to Visa's Tales. Share this with someone who is still waiting to be known, not for what they have built, but for who they are when the morning is quiet and the tea is still warm. Because the right person will always find the thing you forgot to hide. And they will say nothing about it until the time is right.